It's Friday evening, early summer, and I'm in New York City. I'm sitting at my desk, and I'm bathed in the blue light from my computer screen. On my desk, you can see all of the various objects from today, from this week, and from the season. There's my dinner, which was sushi in a little takeout tray from the supermarket. There's my leftover coffee in a mug from this afternoon. There are books on the desk, there are notebooks, and there are checkbooks as well. There are pens and lip balms and hair ties and postage stamps and unmatched earrings and a Metro card. There are a ton of paper napkins for some reason. And there's a computer modem whose lights flash like a heartbeat. There are several Word documents up on that computer screen, and they're each competing for attention. They're not competing with each other so much as with my email. All roads lead back to email. Is it 1997 or is it 2017? It doesn't matter. It's both. In 20 years, my life has come full circle. That's 360 degrees, for real. People often say 360 degrees when they really mean 180. They say full circle when what they're really talking about is a semicircle. But in my case, it's true. At age 47, my life looks very similar to how it looked at 27. So how did I get here? Nearly 2 decades ago, I moved from New York City to the Midwest, and then to California. There, I came as close to settling down as I probably ever will, which is to say that I got married. Nearly 2 years ago, the marriage ended, and I got in the car, and I sort of drove through my life in reverse. I drove west to east. I did the reverse of that move. And then I landed right back where I started, alone in a small apartment in New York City. It's similar to the apartment I lived in when I was in my 20s, when I would eat supermarket sushi at my desk and would try, yes, on a Friday evening, to finish a writing assignment that was due a week ago. There are a few differences between 2017 and 1997, but they're pretty minor. Now I'm writing on a MacBook Air laptop, not a Quadra 650. Now my email comes in automatically, and the opportunities I have to get distracted and to procrastinate exceed anything I could have imagined back then. Thanks to these opportunities, I think that my attention span in 2017 is about 30% of what it was in 1997. However, my rent back then was 30% of what it is now. Same life, higher rent. This could pretty much be the motto of my life after 45. For many years, I had a very different life. I had what we often call a grown-up life. I had a husband, I had a mortgage, and I had a beautiful yard that I had to do maintenance for. There's much to be said for this life. It really has its advantages. For starters, it's pretty lucky to find somebody you like enough to have as your partner. And also, there's just so much about daily life that works better when you're one half of a couple. You never realize what a pain it is to go to all these different social events until you have someone who can go with you. Second glass of wine? Sure! You never realize how much food you have sitting around on high shelves in your kitchen until there's someone who can reach it for you. But even my 1997 self would have told you that the membership associated with these benefits probably wasn't going to be a lifetime deal. My 1997 self would have suspected that all these benefits would lead to a case of imposter syndrome, a case of imposter syndrome severe enough that I would slowly and sadly return to the life I had before. But what I wouldn't have understood back then were the ways in which this return was not a defeat. It was actually sort of a homecoming. I did not know that the life I was living in my 20s, the life I thought was temporary, was in fact the only life for me. This isn't to be confused with my best life, of course, or the life I still sort of believe that I want. What I'm talking about is my set point, the version of myself that I always return to, even if I've managed to pretend to be somebody else for a period of time. It's like an existential version of the number on the bathroom scale that rules your life no matter what you do. You might go a little above it, you might fight your way back down below it, but eventually you always return to the same spot. As for me, I've spent plenty of time over the years fighting my situational set point. I've lived with boyfriends and with roommates and of course with my husband. I've tried to keep my desk neat. And I've listened to all of these studies that say that people who live with long-term partners are healthier and that they live longer than people who live alone and eat standing over the sink with no plates. I've tried to stick it out. I've tried to keep going, but I always swing back. Like it or not, this life is what works for me. I love living alone. I love eating when and where and what I want. I love sleeping when I want and socializing when I want and being able to travel at the last minute without disrupting somebody else's life as a result. I love talking to my friends on the phone for hours without worrying about somebody in the next room overhearing me and, in my imagination, judging me for all of the gossip and the complaining. I love hosting parties by myself. I love drinking that first cup of coffee in the morning while standing by my window and looking out at the boats floating by on the Hudson River. I did all of these things in my 20s, and I loved it. But the only difference was that I didn't realize how much I loved it. Also, my window had a view of a brick wall instead of the river. So here I have to state something obvious. Of course, the part of the reason my life hasn't changed very much is that I'm not a parent. When you don't live with children, you're at the mercy of your own internal clock. And like everything else in the body, your internal clock becomes less reliable with age. So in that sense, my life is very different from that of most women in their 40s. Most of them share their personal space with members of future generations, and so they have no trouble distinguishing the past from the present. If I had a kid, I trust that I wouldn't have any trouble either. At least I hope so, because eating supermarket sushi off a desk that's covered with hair elastics is no life for a child. And neither is having a routine in which it's possible for many days to pass in which there's no need to leave the apartment. If I felt like a recluse in my 20s, I'm a real hermit now. That's because if I need food or clothing or contact lens solution, I don't have to go to a store to buy it. I can just click, buy now, and stay home and wait for the mail. This is a huge improvement in quality of life over having to walk 4 blocks to the nearest pharmacy. The digital age has had a pretty big impact on my shopping habits, but it's left my social life, at least my romantic life, surprisingly untouched. The dating patterns of my 1997 self and my 2017 self are pretty identical, which is to say they're sporadic, unenthusiastic, and marked by an attitude that swings between grouchy and indifferent. In 1997, there were only 2 ways you could end up on a date. You could be set up by somebody else, a third party, or you could happen to meet someone in real life, exchange phone numbers, use the phone number and have an actual voice conversation in which somebody suggests a date and the other person accepts it. Because of all this hard work, it was pretty rare to find yourself in a situation that could be considered a date. I think that throughout my entire 20s, I probably had fewer than 10 proper dates by these criteria. In retrospect, these men who did ask me out on dates were really brave because they had to go through all this hard work, and also they had to sit across the table from me, and I was just as grouchy and pessimistic about the whole thing as I am today. In the age of Tinder and Match.com, you can now go on 7 dates a week, or maybe even twice that many, if you have the energy, and you don't have to have any courage at all. At least that's what I've heard. I'll never know, because every time I load a dating app onto my phone, I delete it and I cancel my subscription after 1 date. In my first 2 years back in New York, I joined and quit OkCupid 3 times, and I went on 3 dates in total. The men were fine, but somehow I could just never muster enough enthusiasm to see them again. They were just no match for the quiet calm of my apartment and the familiar company of my own self. I couldn't imagine going home with any of these men, partly because there's nothing I like more than going home by myself. If this sounds to you like a typical middle-aged woman who's losing her desire, I can tell you that it's not that way at all. I was the same way in my 20s. The relationships I sought out back then were always temporary and preferably long distance. I had a weakness for men who would never work out. I told myself I wanted a real boyfriend, but in hindsight, I can see that I didn't want that. I wanted the safety of impermanence. I wanted something temporary that would be even sweeter because I knew I would come home afterward. When I got divorced, I thought I was entering the triumphant Act 3 of the play of my adulthood. And I thought that finally, I would run toward my future. I would be self-actualized. I would be empowered. And I wasn't totally wrong. Objectively, I'm doing better now than I was back then. My career is going well. I can support myself, and I have slightly better clothes than I did. However, I can't help but worry that whatever value I have would be greater if I was just 10 years younger. A 37-year-old with all these things, quite a catch, right? But a 47-year-old, not so sure. I'm sure that when I'm 57, I'll look back on this and I'll want to smack myself for being so ungrateful. But for the time being, the distance between now and then can sometimes take my breath away. I remember that when I was in graduate school, I thought my professors were so old, but in retrospect, they were probably my age. They were probably in their 40s, and I thought they were around 60. They were probably, I realized that my professors back then who seemed so old were probably the age I am now. Now I'm teaching in the same graduate program, so does that mean that my students think I'm also in my 60s? That seems ridiculous, but I'm afraid it might be true. This is just one of the thoughts that surprise me when I think about how old I have managed to become. At 47, I could easily be the mother of a 25-year-old. And ironically, if I was, I might seem even younger than I am because I would know lots of things about pop culture and things like that that I'm ignorant of. Let me see. I'm not proud of feeling that way. I'm not proud of not being able to tolerate music like Kylie Minogue, for example, because I know that declaring that you can't stand today's music might actually mark the first stage of the dying process. And that brings me back to my apartment window, looking down at the river while listening to the same music I listened to in 1997. The big picture for me these days might be a mix of sadness and confusion and resignation, but in this moment right now, it feels almost perfect. I have work that I enjoy, that lets me earn a good living. I have almost a half century's worth of friends, which is something that is mathematically impossible in your 20s. I'm paying more rent than I can afford, but somehow I'm affording it anyway. And I'm doing better now with meeting my deadlines. So on some cellular level, I know that it will always be Friday evening for me. It'll always be 8 p.m. with me alone at my messy desk. No matter what I do, my life will swing back to its set point. It's kind of anticlimactic, but it's also just as it should be. Everything has its set point in life, except the rent, of course. The rent always goes up. Thank you.